Hey guys, welcome back to the second video in the Compass Games Learn to Play series for The Last Gamble. In this video, developer Rich Hoffman is going to walk us through the most expansive part of this game, movement. There will also be a second part to cover the remainder of the movement modes. So sit back and learn all about movement through the densely forested Ardennes. Over to you, Rich.
Welcome back, gamers, to the second Learn to Play video for The Last Gamble that will cover movement. The mechanics of movement in TLG are more complex than its predecessor, but follow a very straightforward, logical principles. German armor doctrine said that only movement brings victory, and TLG seeks to emulate that. With experience and a thorough study of the rules, you'll find that movement, more than combat, is the key to success in TLG. So in this video, I'll show you how movement works with an emphasis on the use of the player aid cards that pertain to the movement, enemy reaction, and exploitation phases of the game. These include the terrain chart that we've seen before, the terrain effects chart that shows movement costs and restrictions, the movement modification tables that show how strategic movement capabilities work and which movement types can be used in each phase. There's a table for each. The bridge tables that show their effects on movement, particularly the one on how to destroy a bridge. The zone of control chart that shows how movement is hindered by enemy influence and presence. And then the game markers chart that you've seen before that shows what game markers applied in certain movement situations, and they're used as memory aids. And the game aid table that shows how to orient unit counters in certain movement situations, again, as a memory aid. So once you have a setup, and I've created one for the movement phase to show you the basics of it, a good set of forceps to move these counters around on the paper map is a good idea for anybody who hasn't got one yet. Then, to help visualize the basics of this, I've created a small map setup in the southwest part of the map as shown. So let's get into it. In the movement phase, which is Rule 5 in the rulebook, the phasing player or the attacker may move as few or as many units as desired in any direction desired through the use of movement points, or MPs for short. Each unit has a movement allowance that, when combined with its current status, determines how many movement points it may use in that phase. Those movements cannot be exceeded, transferred to another unit, or accumulated from one turn to another. And just as an example, the 15th Fallschirmjäger Panzergrenadier unit has a movement allowance of 6 in the lower right-hand corner. A unit or stack of units must complete its movement before another unit or stack of units may move, which means you can't rock units back and forth one at a time in this manner, going one turn there, 1 point there, 1 point there, 1 point there, 1 point there. All movement has to be completed for each unit before another unit or stack of units starts to move. Next, a unit may not enter an enemy unit's hex, but may move over or stack with friendly units. And we'll get more into that as we get into the different movement types. In the movement phase, reserve and strategic movement designations occur first, and then any other type of activity in the movement phase, which is here, can be done in any order. All movement is subject to the provisions and limitations of the current ground conditions, supply condition, and the terrain effects on movement, zones of control, and stacking limitations that I'll cover here in this movement video. Temporary conditions that can also affect movement are noted in footnote number 36 to this paragraph in the rules, and one example of them is disruption by air attack, which prevents a unit from moving while it's disrupted. Now I'll get into the different types of movement in The Last Gamble, and there are 6 of them, basic types of movement. The first thing I'm going to do, since they all use this chart, is orient you to the terrain effects chart. It has 3 columns, one on the left, which describes the terrain that the unit would enter and the type of movement that it would use, and then 2 charts which contain the cost of entering a hex in any of these conditions on the left. One column for motorized units one column for non-motorized units. And going back to our example here, units with an underlying movement allowance are motorized, and units without an underline in the movement allowance are non-motorized, so they use each of these columns appropriately. The armored unit would use the motorized column, the non-armored unit would use the non-motorized column. Within each of those columns, they're subdivided again into the current ground condition. The current ground condition is a part of the weather phase that we went over in the previous video, and it is going to be in effect for the entire date, morning and nighttime, that is in effect at that time. So if the ground condition is firm, the units are going to use this subcolumn within the motorized conditions and this subcolumn for non-motorized units. If the ground conditions are mud, they'll use this column and this column. If they're frozen, as they are in the Battle Before the Meuse scenario, they'll use this column for frozen and the frozen column for the non-motorized units. And if the weather turns really bad to snow, they'll use this column. And as you can see, when it starts snowing, things get really slow. There are a number of notes in some of the rows here that are amplified down below. So for example, in west wall terrain, Allied units may only enter west wall terrain using normal or minimal movement. I'll get to that movement type when we get to it. And German units may enter the west wall terrain using any allowable movement type except for march movement. The reason for this is west wall terrain, and I'm just going to show some to you. Over here along the German border are these heavily engineered defenses along the German border, and they contain many things like mines, trenches, pillboxes, booby traps, etc., and those types of things hinder movement more so for the Allies than the Germans, and that's just an effect of west wall terrain. The first basic type of movement in TLG is normal movement. Using normal movement, any non-static unit that is not isolated, not disrupted, and not resting from fatigue may enter a hex without the benefit of a highway, road, or trail by paying the full movement cost of the hex side crossed and the hex entered. I'm going to use these three units to demonstrate this. This unit is motorized, and non-motorized. So this one first. This is a motorized unit. We're going to have firm terrain as the ground condition, and we're going to be moving to the southwest. In this column, we see that we have a straight progression. Clear terrain is 1, rough terrain is 2, woods are 3, and forest is 4. So we're going to move this unit 2 movement points into the rough, plus 1 movement point into the clear, and he only has a movement allowance of 6, so he can't enter the forest because that would take 4 more, and he can't exceed what he has. So the most he can do if he wants to continue moving in normal movement is to move to the northwest for a total of 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he's done moving. The armored unit is going to move in the same direction, and it uses the same column, and it uses the same subcolumn. To move southwest in normal movement, he's going to move here for 3. He's going to move here for 2, that's 5. He cannot enter the forest hex. He cannot enter a woods hex because they would exceed his movement allowance of 6. Therefore, his only option to continue moving west is to move into the clear terrain for 1, so he would have a total of 6 movement points. Now we'll use this unit to demonstrate normal movement for non-motorized units. We're going to use this column on the firm subcolumn, and we'll note that the values in this column are less than the values in that column for motorized units. So we're going to move in the same type of direction, and we're going to move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's normal movement. The second basic movement in TLG is road movement, and it's one of the movement types that will be used most often because most of the units in the game are motorized. In road movement, any non-static unit may enter a hex at a lower movement point cost when using highways, roads, or trails under the following conditions. Number 1, the unit has to move through continuous road hexes, paying the road movement cost for the current ground condition. You can't skip hexes. 2, non-motorized units may enter a friendly, motorized, or non-motorized unit's hex using road movement without any additional cost. And that's important because a motorized unit can enter a friendly, non-motorized unit's hex using road movement at no additional cost. But a motorized unit may not enter the hex of another motorized unit using road movement. It must instead use normal movement, march movement, which we'll get to, and infantry only can do that, or minimal movement, which all units can do, but they only move one hex. I'm going to demonstrate this with these units in the center here. And we're going to move the artillery first, okay? The artillery unit is non-motorized, and it has a movement allowance of 3 movement points. This is a horse-drawn artillery unit, very, very slow. So it's going to move to the west, 1, 2, 3 movement points. Now it is still moving. It's on its moved side. It is not deployed, and that is going to complicate any other motorized unit through this hex. I'm next going to move this tank unit. He's got a movement allowance of 5. He's motorized, and he's going to use the road to move to the west. So he's going to move over the bridge along the road. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now in both these cases, we had a non-motorized unit moving along a trail, and it was firm ground conditions, 1 movement point per hex. The motorized unit moving along a road, firm ground conditions, 1 movement point per hex, and that's what we used. The third unit I'll use is this engineer unit that has a movement allowance of 6, and he's motorized. For him to move to the west, he can take one of 3 paths along the road. He can go this way to the southwest. He can go this way, but not very far because this unit is blocking the road for road movement. Or he can move this way as far as he can. So I'm going to move him 1, 2 over the bridge because there's no road between these 2 hexes. 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, this was motorized unit, firm ground conditions, along a road or a highway. Highway was 1/2 movement point, but when you change from a highway to another road and you've got a 1/2 movement point left over, you lose it. So that is the end of road movement for these 3 types of units. The third type of basic movement in TLG is strategic movement. And in strategic movement, any motorized, allied engineer, or allied infantry unit that is in good order, not fatigued or resting from fatigue, and not in reserve may use strategic movement in the owning player's movement phase only. Strategic movement allows a unit to use road movement at up to 4 to 5 times its movement allowance under the following conditions. Number 1, the unit must be designated at the beginning of the movement phase for going into or continuing to move in strategic movement. The unit may not move adjacent to another friendly unit that is in strategic movement along the same road. Number 3, the unit may not enter the hex of a friendly unit that is not in strategic movement, and the exceptions to that are a non-motorized unit in a city, town, or village, like this one here, or a deployed artillery, flak, anti-aircraft, or engineer unit in any hex. The next condition is enemy proximity. If the enemy is close by, you cannot move too close in strategic movement. If you're an armor unit or an armored infantry or panzer grenadier, You cannot move closer than 2 hexes away from an enemy unit. Say this one down here. If you're a non-armored unit, you cannot move within 4 hexes of an enemy unit. And that's because the enemy units have artillery and spotters, and they shoot at moving columns whenever they can. The next condition is that road movement and stacking limits apply. And we talked about road movement. We'll get to stacking limits, but I'll not violate them during our examples. And units in strategic movement do not exert a zone of control. They defend at half strength, and they cannot blow a bridge, build an improved position, or build a roadblock. We'll get to those capabilities in the engineer phase in the third video. So for strategic movement, we use the different table. We use the strategic movement table. And to orient you to that real quickly, we have the types of units on the left-hand column. We have their base movement allowance, which in this particular example, this is a motorized unit, movement allowance of 6. He is not armored. He will be here. Flak, rocket artillery, German motorized engineers, basic allowance of 6. And then we have the 3 different movement point values that the unit can use depending on when he goes into strategic movement or whether he's continuing to move in strategic movement. And I'll go over those next. To do that, I'm going to use these 3 motorized units to enter strategic movement. First of all, they are more than 4 hexes away from any enemy unit, so the enemy proximity limitation is not an issue. So he's going to enter strategic movement, and enter strategic movement. The game markers for entering strategic movement always point upward. And that's because the amount of movement points that a unit can use when they enter strategic movement on the map is different than if they entered the strategic movement as a reinforcement. We'll get to those later. The next thing we have to worry about is which of these movements can move now and which of them have to wait for another unit to move, because one of the restrictions is that units in strategic movement cannot move adjacent to each other along the same road. An example of that is this unit, which would like to move to the west, but if he moves here, he cannot move here because that would be adjacent to this unit, which is also in strategic movement. So this unit is going to have to move first, or this movement is going to have to move first. So given that we'd like to get the artillery moving forward as quickly as we can, we're going to move him first. Now, he is a motorized unit with a movement allowance of 6. He is non-armored, and he uses this row on this column. He's on the map, and he's going to enter strategic movement. He can now use 15 movement points. And I'm just going to move him 15 movement points to the southwest. We still have motorized, firm ground conditions. To move this unit in strategic movement with a motorized unit moving along trails and roads, and a highway is 1/2, but we're going to lose that half movement point when we switch from a highway to a road. We're going to move 1 movement point per hex. So we're going to move the artillery forward first, and he's going to move 1 movement point along the trails and the roads and the highway to get as far west as he can. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now this is another motorized unit, but it is an engineer, and engineers have a special movement capability that allows another motorized unit to enter their hex, because the engineers, unless they're in strategic movement, are actually distributed throughout a very broad area. So we can move 1 more movement point into here, but he cannot enter the hex with this armored unit because it does not have that capability. So in this hex, we have 2 units, but one of them is exercising that special exception for engineers. Next, we're going to move the flak, and he's going to move along the same path, recognizing that the road through the forest is blocked by the artillery. So, same movement allowances. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He cannot move into this hex because it would be moving adjacent to another unit in strategic movement. Last, we're going to move this guy. This guy uses a slightly different section of the table. He is an armored unit. He is a Panzer Grenadier. He has a movement of 6. And instead of having a movement allowance of 15, he's got a movement points now of only 12. That is a function of the way that these units move that we spent a lot of time on in the development phase, but this is the table and this is what you get. So he's going to move 12 movement points and there's no one else in the way. He's going to move along the same path using the same movement point costs per road hex. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and he can go either 9, 10, but he has to stop moving there because there's no other place for him to go. There's no other roads that go out of that hex. So those are the examples of strategic movement. The important thing to remember is that when you're on the map, you use this column. And I've got one other example that I can use for reinforcements when we get to the reinforcement phase of this video. If these units were already in strategic movement on their next turn and they wanted to continue in strategic movement, we would actually change the marker from pointing upward to pointing to the left. And instead of moving this number of movement points to enter strategic movement, they would use this column for on-map continuation of strategic movement, and you can see the movement factors are doubled. A motorized unit on a highway in the last gamble can move from one corner of the map almost to the other, as long as they use the 1/2 movement point per hex on highways. That's why defending highways and other high-speed avenues of approach is a really good idea to compete in this game. The fourth type of basic movement in the last gamble is march movement. This can only be used by infantry units in the phasing player's movement phase, and those units may not be adjacent to enemy units at any time during their movement, at the beginning when they start, during their movement, or at the end. March movement allows a unit to use normal movement under any firm, mud, or frozen ground condition at a reduction of 1 movement point per hex. Terrain entry and hexside costs and restrictions apply. To demonstrate march movement, I'm going to use the 5th Fallschirmjäger 13th Regiment here, which is a non-motorized infantry unit that is not adjacent to an enemy unit and wants to move to the southwest where there are no other enemy units. And as we look on the terrain effects chart for non-motorized units, we see that it would cost normally 3 movement points to enter a forest and 2 movement points to enter the woods. But in this case, using march movement, it's going to cost 1 movement point less per hex. So in this demonstration, he's going to go 2, 4, and then he can move south 5. Again, the important thing about this is it can only occur with infantry units, either mechanized infantry units or non-motorized infantry units, and they have this proximity of enemy units that they have to deal with and they have to stay away from them. And that's it for march movement. The 5th basic movement type in Last Gamble is forced march. And in a forced march, in the phasing player's night movement phase, an armor or infantry unit that is in good order, is not in strategic movement or reserve, it is not resting from fatigue, and is not adjacent to an enemy unit at any time during its movement, may double its movement allowance. Armor units may use normal or road movement only. Infantry may use normal movement, road movement, and or march movement only. And I'm going to demonstrate that using the two units that are above us here, these two, and just assume that it's at night. There are no enemy units that they're adjacent to or going to be adjacent to, and they're going to use road movement, normal movement, or march movement for the non-motorized unit here. So I'm going to use this unit to move to the west on a forced march, and he's going to double his movement allowance from 5 to 10. He's going to use either road movement or normal movement or march movement during this movement, and he has to stay not adjacent to an enemy unit. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if he wanted to enter the forest, he would normally have to spend 3, but using march movement, he could do it with 2, so that's 9, 10. At the end of a forced march, a unit that conducted it becomes fatigued and has to put a fatigue marker on them. I'm going to move the armored unit in the same manner and in the same direction, but an armored unit can only use road movement or normal movement. So here we go. This unit has a movement allowance of 8. He gets to double it, so now he can use 16 movement points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then to go into the woods, he needs to spend 3, 12, 13, 14. He doesn't want to get too far out ahead of everybody else, so he's just going to take his forced march, and he's fatigued, and he'll be there until he recovers. On the following AM or daytime turn, fatigue units may not enter strategic movement or reserve. Their movement allowance is halved. They defend at full strength. They may blow a bridge and may begin to build an improved position unless they're in an enemy zone of control. And at the end of the daytime game turn, this would be the following day, they would flip their fatigue marker to resting. On the nighttime game turn, after they conducted a forced march, they may not enter reserve or strategic movement. They may not move. They do exert a zone of control, and they do defend at full strength. They may blow a bridge. They may not complete an improved position. And at the end of the nighttime game turn, which was the night after they conducted a forced march, the resting counter would be removed, and they can resume normal operations. So the key about forced marches is it allows a unit to double its movement points. It can move across the map to some critical terrain, which is got to be taken quickly. But once they get there, they're going to be diminished in their ability to move. They're going to be diminished in their ability to attack. And they'll be diminished in their ability to continue operations at full capability. The sixth basic movement type in the last gamble is minimal movement. In the owning player's movement phase, the enemy reaction phase, or exploitation phase, a unit may move 1 hex regardless of other restrictions. Hexside terrain entry and stacking limits apply, but a unit may not move from one enemy zone of control to another. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use this French unit down here. And if the bridge were blown here and he wanted to move across the river, he could do it using minimal movement. And that would be 5 movement points. That would be all of his movement. He cannot move any further. Minimal movement is really valuable and often the only type of movement that one can use when a motorized unit wants to enter another motorized unit's hex. This frequently occurs when a unit has to cross a bridge or wants to cross a road severe terrain hex side. I'm going to use these two units to demonstrate that. This unit is a motorized unit. This unit is a motorized unit. This unit, if it were here and wanted to move along this road, could not enter this hex because of the severe terrain hex side here. He has to use minimal movement to cross it. And in this case, if he started the turn here and this unit was here, he could use his full movement allowance of 6 to enter that hex. The final section in the basic movement types in the last gamble is combined movement. And combined movement is covered on this table beneath the strategic movement table on the movement modification table's player aid card. It is a busy table, but the simple structure of it is you have unit types on the left-hand column, and you have the phases of movement that they can move in across the top. There are only 3 phases in the game turn that a unit can move: in the movement phase, in the enemy reaction phase, and the exploitation phase. Only those 3 phases use movement points where units can move, okay? There's one exception in the combat phase, but I'll get to that in the next video. We have different phases of movement at night than we do in the daytime. They're the same type of movement in the same phase, but the type of movement that can be used in each of those by these unit types changes from day to night. So that's why we built this table. So to demonstrate the different types of units and their different status, I'm going to use these 3 units to show what type of movement each can use in each different phase. I'm going to start with the armor unit, this one. An armor unit that is not in reserve in its own movement phase may use normal movement or road movement, or it may use strategic movement. Those abbreviations are down here at the bottom. In the enemy reaction phase, an armor unit that is not in reserve cannot move. And in the exploitation phase, an armor unit that is not in reserve cannot move. If the armor unit were in reserve, we can look down here and we can see a combat reserve armored unit or an exploitation reserve armored unit can use these types of movement. And we'll get to these when we get to reserve movement. But the key to this table is that you look up the type of unit that it is, what status it's in, and the table will tell you what type of basic movement it can use. Strategic movement, normal movement, road movement is the typical type of movement that any of them can have. The differences in this table typically exist at night when march movement or forced march is available. And those are typically the differences you'll see between movement at night and movement in the daytime. This is an extremely important table in the movement scheme of the last gamble because of play balance. To allow units to use strategic movement in various phases would extremely unbalance the game, and we restricted certain types of movement to certain game phases to maintain that play balance. This table shows which ones can be used at what time by any type of unit in any given status, and those are the ones that can be used, and have fun with it. All right, that does it for the basic types of movement in the last gamble, and I'll move on to section 5.2 of the movement rules, the terrain effects on movement, where I'm going to speak to what type of terrain will affect what type of unit and their ability to maneuver across or into it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is severe terrain hex sides. Severe terrain hex sides are a new feature in the game and put the last gamble way out in front of every other Bulge game that's ever been published, because we depict the rolling and steep nature of the terrain in ways that hasn't been done before. To go over briefly what we talked about in the introductory video, a severe terrain hexside represents an extremely steep slope, which can be from a hill, from a ridge line, as in this case here, or especially along rivers where we have deep gullies, and we even have what can either be a hill or a creek. We don't depict creeks on the map, we only depict rivers, but the severe terrain hexside that doesn't have a watercourse is often an indication of exactly that. I'm going to use these 3 units in the middle to demonstrate how severe terrain hexsides can be moved across. The first one we're going to consider is a non-road severe terrain hexside, which is simply a severe terrain hexside that is not crossed by a highway, a road, or a trail. Severe terrain hexsides that don't contain a road can be navigated by infantry units, but not armor units. Only infantry units can pass a non-road severe terrain hexside. If they're mechanized or motorized, as this one is, they can only use minimum movement or all of their movement points to cross a severe terrain hexside. So in this case, if this unit wanted to move northwest, it would spend all 6 of its movement points to do so. Since only infantry can cross a non-severe terrain hexside, this armor unit, if it wanted to follow, would have to use other types of movement and other hexes to get there. So in this case, he might move 2 here, and 3 is 5. And if he wanted to move into that hex, he'd have to wait till next turn, because that would be 7 movement points using normal movement, or 1 movement point for road movement, in which case those 2 units would now be together. I'm going to back this one up because I don't want to overstack the hex when I move the next unit. A non-motorized infantry unit, which doesn't have the underline under its movement allowance, can move across a non-severe terrain hexside by spending 1 additional movement point over the cost of movement. Now, if we were to look at this and say it's a PM night turn and this unit was not close to the enemy and he wanted to use march movement to join his other regiment in that hex, he could move 1 point here, 1 point here, and 2 points here, spending 1 to go into the hex and 1 to cross the severe terrain hexside. The other types of units in the game to include artillery, motorized or not, flak or anti-aircraft units, motorized or not, engineer units, motorized or not, rocket artillery, motorized or not. None of them can cross a non-road severe terrain hexside. They have to do what the other armor unit did here, use other types of movement to move around it. The second type of severe terrain hexside is the one that is crossed by a road. And in this hex, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the hexsides are crossed by roads, trails, or highways. Any unit can use road movement to cross those hexsides without any further movement point costs. So this would be 1 movement point. This would be 1 movement point. A non-motorized unit can do the same thing, and any unit can use road movement to do that, with the one exception that when a motorized unit wants to enter the hex of another friendly motorized unit, the severe terrain hexside, even though it has a road here, will prevent the unit from joining it in road movement. Severe terrain road hexsides can only be crossed using road movement. And if the unit is using road movement, in this example, if he moves 1 point here and wants to move 1 other point there, the severe terrain hexside prevents him from doing it. He would have to start his turn in this hex and use minimal movement or all his movement points to enter that hex. This is frequently the movement method that motorized units have to use when they start stacking up on each other in front of rivers or severe slopes and severe terrain. When they want to mass and move into a hex with each other to increase their combat power or their defensive capabilities or anything else, the severe terrain hex sides are going to create these mini jams of the traffic throughout much of the map. And it's one of the things which makes the efficient use of road movement very, very critical in this game. And this is perhaps the most important example of that. The next type of terrain to consider is a lake or a reservoir. And here's an example of a lake on the map. And I'm not going to try to read the French here. The Étang de la Fabrique. It is a hex side crossed by a lake, and no unit of any type can cross it. So, for example, the Fallschirmjäger Regiment, if it were located here and it wanted to cross this hex side to here, it can't do it. It's going to have to move around it. The next terrain feature we'll consider are waterway hex sides. And to do that, we'll have to get to one. Waterway hex sides are the Meuse River, which goes around the entire map, and we'll move over here to get to a section of it where we can demonstrate how a unit can cross a waterway hex side. Any unit can use road movement to cross a waterway hex side across an intact bridge of sufficient capacity. An infantry unit may use minimal movement to cross an unbridged waterway hex side using engineer assistance. In our example here, we have the 193rd Glider Regiment that wants to move across the Meuse River using a bridge and using road movement at one movement point. If, on the other hand, he were across the river that did not have a bridge and he wanted to move across the river, he would need engineer assistance to do so. Engineer assistance is a special rule that allows an infantry unit to cross a waterway hex side without the use of a bridge by getting an assist from the engineers who provide the boats and the rafts and other things to float the unit across the waterway. An engineer unit and an infantry unit have to start the movement phase in the same hex, and the infantry unit can simply move across the river. And as long as the infantry unit and the engineer unit remain adjacent to each other, either in this hex or this hex, the infantry unit can maintain its current supply status. Now I'm going to talk about bridges. And there's three important things to remember about bridges. First of all, there's three types. Heavy road bridges, which are the double hashed symbols here, can carry any kind of unit. They've got the capacity and the weight to carry heavy artillery down to foot soldiers. Light bridges, the single hashed units, are restricted in their ability to carry units over them to infantry, engineers, light armor, rocket artillery, headquarters units, and commandos. The third type of bridge is a rail bridge. There's very few of them on the map, and those can also carry any type of unit. However, they are not connected to any roads. The second thing to remember is that for road bridges, the only type of movement you can use over a bridge is either road movement or strategic movement, or, as we found out with motorized units trying to enter each other's hexes, you can use minimal movement. The third thing to remember is that for rail bridges, you don't use road movement to go over a rail bridge. You use normal movement and add one movement point. Any unit can do this, but the terrain value is going to be the value that you enter the hex in. So in this example, we've got an infantry unit, which is non-motorized, firm ground conditions, wants to enter the forest. It'll cost him 3 movement points to do that and 1 to cross the rail bridge. So he'd go 4 movement points to there. If he wanted to continue moving, he could move along the trail at 1 movement point to either this hex, or this hex. But if he wanted to move due south, he would have to spend another 3 movement points plus 1 for the severe terrain which if he's already spent 4 movement points to get here would total 8, and that would be more than his movement allowance of 5. So that's the example of road bridges. The next thing to consider about bridges is that bridges exist on the map where they're depicted, but they will not always be there, because when the enemy tries to cross them, either through movement or through combat or through advance after combat or a retreat, a friendly unit in close proximity may try to blow the bridge to deny the enemy's movement over it. In this particular instance, I'm going to use these 2 units to show the effects of trying to blow these bridges if they were going to attack over these hexes and attack these units. First of all, the bridge tables are the ones that we're going to use. The bridge demolition table will describe the die roll that's used when the unit tries to move or attack over the bridge, the enemy unit, and then the type of unit and its proximity to the bridge. The important thing about a unit that can blow a bridge is that it can only be a combat unit, not a headquarters or commando. The unit has to be in good order. It cannot be in strategic movement or reserve, and it may attempt to blow the bridge when the enemy moves, attacks, or retreats across it, when it is in range with a clear path to the bridge. Now, a clear path is an important thing to consider. The clear path to a bridge is blocked if the path must traverse an unbridged river or waterway hexside, a non-road marsh terrain or non-road severe terrain hexside, or a hex containing an enemy unit or their zone of control. And if a combat unit is in an enemy zone of control, it will negate that interdiction for this purpose. There are some die roll modifiers which are particular in the rules. I'll lead you to and not get to here, but I'll just say that if these units want to attack across the bridges, first of all, this is a infantry unit. This is a light bridge. It can cross it, so it can attack across it. This is an armor unit. This is a heavy bridge. It can attack across it. And the units on this side can try to blow the bridges if they do this. Now, we're going to discuss which ones can do it and what their values would be. Engineer units are the most proficient at blowing bridges. If they are an engineer battalion with 2 hashes above the unit symbol, they can blow 1 bridge per game turn. If they are an engineer regiment with 3 hashes above the unit symbol, they can blow 2 bridges per game turn because there's more of them. Any other non-engineer combat unit can blow 1 bridge per game turn. Now we'll get to the procedure for how you actually do it. The bridge demolition table contains a die roll column on the left, and it contains 3 columns that discuss the nationality of the unit trying to blow it and what proximity they're to the bridge and what type of unit they are. An engineer unit within 2 hexes has basically a 50% chance of blowing a bridge when the enemy tries to cross it, if it's allied. If it's German, that value goes down. Any other unit, such as this one, that wants to try to blow a bridge can do it on a 1 or a 2 if it's allied, or a 1 if it's German. Why is that? Because the Germans wanted to keep as many bridges as they could for counterattacks, etc. And try to rebuild bridges is an expensive process. An engineer unit within 4 hexes has a very small chance of blowing a bridge, but if you consider that this engineer unit could blow this bridge, or even this bridge over here, it's a good capability to have if you're in extremis. There are some die roll modifiers for blowing bridges, which are in the modifications below. You add 1 to the die roll for a zone of control emanating from a non-crossing enemy unit. For example, if this unit exerts a zone of control across the river, and say this were a heavy bridge here and this unit tried to cross it, when he crosses it, the die roll modifier is going to be increased, which makes it less likely that the defenders will blow the bridge. Another example is if a lead commando attached to a crossing German unit is there, but I'll get to that when we talk about optional rules. For all Liege bridges around the city of Liege, they have a decreased chance of blowing because they're so important. And there's one engineer unit for the Americans who was really talented at blowing bridges. He gets a -1 die roll modifier, which makes it easier. But in this particular case, we're going to say as this unit attacks over the bridge, the French unit here is going to try to blow it. And let's say he rolls a 2. He's another type of unit. He's allied. He rolls a 2. There are no modifiers, and he would blow the bridge. And we place the bridge marker here. The arrow on the bridge marker should point towards the bridge that's blown. And in many cases, we're going to have bridges on multiple hex sides of the same hex. Let's say this unit attacks next, and it wants to attack across the bridge. And the engineer here, or even this engineer over here, because he's within 2 hexes, could use this table on the allied engineer bridge. There are no modifiers. And let's say he rolls a 5. If he rolls a 5, he's ineffective, and this bridge is not blown. And this enemy unit can now attack across this bridge. We'll get to the combat effects of bridges being blown or not blown and attacking across rivers when we get to the video on the combat phase. The next thing I'll talk about is building bridges after they've been blown. And this is a capability which only engineers can do, and it's described in section 9.1 of the engineer rules, but the first part of it takes place in the movement phase where we are now. So we're going to assume that since the attacks here have either been broken off or they're going to look for other bridges. Yeah. And this bridge is blown, we're going to assume that the allied player wants to rebuild it. To do so, an engineer unit has to start the movement phase in the hex with the blown bridge. And then engineers have the capability over an entire game turn to start rebuilding the bridge by observing that the blown bridge marker is there. And in the engineer phase, which occurs near the end of the turn, they just repair the bridge, and it's now available for use. So building the bridge is a 2-phase process, started in the movement phase by an engineer that starts the hex where he wants to rebuild the bridge and ends in the engineer phase. The intervening phases, being combat and exploitation, can have an effect on whether that process finishes. The next type of terrain we'll consider are fords. And there is a player aid card called Movement Examples. And at the bottom of that, there are 3 images of a particular ford, which can illustrate the types of units that can cross a ford and how many movement points it'll take to do each one. I've moved the map to hex 4324 near the start line for the German units. And there are 3 units in the hex. And these are the 3 types of units that can cross a ford. From left to right, a light armor unit, a mechanized infantry unit or armored infantry panzer grenadier, and a non-motorized infantry unit. These are the only 3 types of units that can cross a ford, and the type of ford will depict whether they can cross it or not and how many movement points they have to spend. These are shown on the gray line here on the terrain effects chart, which is for fords. A ford can be crossed using normal movement or road movement, and the note down below explains which units can do it. So armored infantry, panzer grenadiers, and light armor pay 3 movement points above the cost of entering the hex to cross a ford. A non-motorized infantry pays 2 movement points above the cost of entering the next hex. An approach trail, severe terrain hex sides, and terrain entry restrictions all apply. and no other units may cross fords, and this is in Rule 5.2.7. Now, there's a terrain description here which you haven't heard before called an approach trail. An approach trail exists across a ford, and it is a trail that goes from one hex to another. And I'm just going to move these units out of the way so you can see what it is. The ford is here. There's a trail which connects both hexes, but there's a river across it. This is just a shallow area which units can cross, and when they do so, they use road movement to enter the next hex they're entering, and then they pay for the ford and any severe terrain that may occur there. So I'm going to move these units back, and we'll talk about each one in turn. In our example, I'm going to use the non-motorized unit first, and the image on the movement examples chart to help you understand how many movement points it takes to go across. From where 1130th Regiment is now, if he wants to move north, there's a bridge there, and we'll assume that the bridge is intact. There's a trail which connects these two hexes across the bridge, and to move across it would be one movement point to move along a trail in firm ground conditions. If instead he wants to move across the ford along an approach trail, he would do so using road movement at one movement point to enter this hex, and he'd spend 2 movement points to cross the ford for a total of 3 movement points. He would now have 2 additional movement points left in his movement allowance to move north, here, or southwest. Lastly, if he wants to cross a ford that does not have an approach trail like this one, he has to pay normal movement to enter this hex. He has to pay 2 movement points to cross the ford, and he has to pay the additional movement point to cross the severe terrain. So that would be 2 to enter the woods, 2 to cross the ford, and 1 for the severe terrain hex side for a total of 5 movement points. He now can't move anywhere else. He's expended. That's it for him. Now we're going to consider the mechanized unit. The mechanized unit uses the motorized column for fords, and if he wants to cross at a bridge, he can do so using road movement, and it'll be 1 movement point on the trail. If instead he wants to cross the ford with an approach trail, he can do so by spending road movement to enter this hex and 3 movement points to cross the ford. So that would be 1 movement point, and 3 movement points is 4. And now he has 2 movement points left where he can move north, he can move south, he can even move into that hex because it's only 2 to move into a rough hex, or he can move along this trail. So another 2 movement points to do that. Lastly, if he wanted to move over a hex side with a ford that does not have an approach trail, he has to spend normal movement to move into this hex, and for firm terrain, a motorized unit, it's 3 movement points. He has to spend an additional 3 movement points to cross the ford, and since this is severe terrain, he would have to spend all of his movement points to cross the severe terrain. So in this case, he has to use minimal movement to cross into this hex, and he has no movement remaining. Those are the examples for him. The last unit is a light armored unit. This is the only type of armored unit that can cross a ford. He has a lot of movement points, so it makes it a little easier for him, but he has to pay the same costs as the armored infantry. So if he wants to cross a river at a bridge, and light armored units can use light bridges. It does so using 1 movement point in normal firm ground conditions. If instead he wants to move over a ford which has an approach trail, he uses road movement to enter the hex he's entering. He pays 3 additional movement points to cross the ford. So he would pay 1 plus 3 is 4, and he has 5 movement points remaining to move quite a ways. Lastly, if he wants to move across a ford without an approach trail, he would have to use normal movement, but armored units are not allowed to cross severe terrain using normal movement. So he would be prohibited from crossing into this hex. A armor unit can only cross a ford along a ford that has an approach trail. That's the thing to remember. And that's it for fords.